I feel I have way too many terms that I need to define here. But thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this. It's been a real gift. It's been just wonderful to hear the discussions throughout the day. I'm going to try and sort of step back a little bit, perhaps, and what I'm going to present here is actually a sort of a general outline of a book that I have just completed. And the book is actually it's an ethnography. I am an anthropologist. I'm going to insert people into this presentation throughout, both in the visuals as well as in the discussion. And my ethnography has been with women of a political party, a very militant political party. It's actually a right-wing political party, even though it came and grew in the 1960s out of a very particular kind of populist movement. It's sort of taken this turn towards the right. And in India, you simply cannot discuss any kind of activism without discussion of political parties. And in this case, I'm actually going to talk about how, and I'm trying here to theorize sort of a feminist theory of the state by looking at the state through the city. And the case I'm going to discuss here is actually how women of this political party, working class women, have been participating in slum redevelopment in the city of Mumbai and have come to sort of take on these roles as very important brokers, patrons. Political science has actually theorized patronage tremendously. My book is actually a theory of matronage. Not to essentialize this, but it is because a lot of the time, ideas about global cities tend to focus on the actions of growth machines, political, transnational corporations and things like that. But those who are actually addressing what might seemingly look like private concerns, like water, housing development, all of these kinds of things, because women really do bear the brunt of urban degradation in places like Mumbai, that these tend to get left out of the global city making. They certainly get talked about in the context of resisting neoliberalism, whatever that might mean, and I'm very uncomfortable actually with that term, coming at this from a theoretical perspective of Asia, particularly South and Southeast Asia, and I will discuss that a little bit here. So, okay, it's interesting. Thank you, Elizabeth. We both use, yeah.
I guess before you start, are you going to address what is meant by conservative political party in India?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. I will not say conservative, I will call them right-wing. I will call them non-liberal. Largely because they actually go back and forth between, they use a lot of strategies that we might associate with progressive politics, but it's done with very much with an exclusionary nativist kind of stance, and more recently anti-Muslim. This is a Hindu nationalist party, a Hindu majoritarian political party. So, okay, it's interesting that the word visceral has come up multiple times. Politics in India, particularly in urban India, is very much about a viscerality where it actually can be touched. You can touch your political representative, they're living amongst you, and particularly this political party, which is called the Shiv Sena, which literally translates to mean Shivaji's army. Shivaji was a 16th century Maratha warrior, king, and the party is actually named after him. But anyway, so these are some of the themes that I'm addressing in my book. And I think, the last thing I think is something, given that this is a comparative workshop, my idea, looking at how women participate and how public housing or slum redevelopment takes place in the context of Mumbai, I want to really talk about how we can think of neoliberal urbanism in India. And I think that in Asia, what has happened is the two cases, China and Singapore, which are really the exceptions in Asia in the sense that they have had a significant public sector presence in housing. So how do we then talk about the neoliberalization of public space, particularly when it comes to housing, in places like all of South Asia and most of Southeast Asia, where a public presence has actually never existed? So this sort of complicates the idea of neoliberalism a little bit. But let me talk a little bit about women in this political party. Okay, this is this is a quote from one of the women that I actually ended up spending a lot of time with. So I will say I lived in this slum that I'm talking about here for almost 4.5 years. First I lived there about 1.5 years, and I ended up actually living with a woman who was in fact the slumlord in this region, in this neighborhood. And this is a neighborhood that is on the outskirts, used to be on the outskirts of Mumbai. And this is why I use the term peri-urban. Again, it's very problematic because it has all kinds of, marginality attached to it, the term peri-urban. But in the case of this neighborhood or this area, usually you think about peri-urban as the dynamics where people get shifted out of the city and marginalized because of land speculation and property prices and whatnot. And that certainly happens in Mumbai. However, in this case, there's a different dynamic going on where the borders of the city actually came to them. So, and then thinking through this idea of mobility, we often think of borders as sort of these things that, exist, but often borders arrive at people's doorsteps where they don't exist, and here I'm talking about urban borders. So this is actually an expression of the ways in which a politics of local personality is intimately connected to broader logics of urban protection. So all political housing activism in Mumbai takes place through this narrative of urban protection, and it's almost always through a political party. Every slum in Mumbai is dominated by one political party or the other. I am actually talking about this particular political party, the Shiv Sena, which has used very violent tactics, a lot of aggression. Women are equally aggressive as the men. Colleagues of mine who've been working in other parts of Mumbai have actually pointed out that very similar kinds of tactics against the state, and again, this problematizes the state because these are actors who actually belong to political parties, but they're constantly working both inside and outside the state. So sort of coming back to your idea of democracy, Ilan, what you talked about, where the state begins and ends is very, very murky in the case of India. Nothing happens without some political patronage. And people who resist the state are often people who are part of the state, right? I mean, I think, an anthropologist, Thomas Hansen, who's actually written about the Shiv Sena quite extensively several years ago, about Shiv Sena men, has actually used this very interesting metaphor where the mayor of the city was actually burning his own building, right? So this is the way in which the state constantly acts against the state itself. And that's why I think understanding the city, understanding the Indian state through the lens of the city sort of brings up a lot of very productive kinds of things. And here we go. Here are some of these women. They participate tremendously in not all of them are elected leaders, many of them are just self-appointed, nominated leaders, but all of them participate in a sort of public politics in order to get nominated for an electoral seat at the city council level. This is another, this is the kind of infrapolitics that I'm talking about. I use this term, I draw this term from the political scientist, anthropologist, Jim Scott, who talks about politics, that infrapolitics is sort of a way in which subordinated groups tend to use everyday kinds of politics to resist. Again, I don't use the term resist at all. I actually look at these politicians as points of friction, and it sort of draws from some of the work that's been done in geography and the studies, mobility studies. I'll quote from someone like Tim Cresswell, who uses, because these are not resistors, they're people who actually cause friction in particular kinds of urban planning practices. So this is sort of a, this is a political party that is regional. These are some of the women that I worked very closely with. The woman who has the turban on her head is someone I actually lived with for a very long time in the city of Mumbai, and she's taken on this kind of masculine, the turban is usually worn by men at ritual events in India. This woman was always putting the turban on in public. So it's this very interesting kind of way in which, some people, when I've shown them this picture, they said, oh, it's drag. Well, yeah. Judith Butler would have a lot to say about this. But, okay, here she is again. This is actually the cover picture for the book. She's on an ubiquitous cell phone. She's being called on all the time by her constituents for practically anything they need. So this is the region I'm actually going to talk about. This is an area around Film City. Film City is actually a major studio where Bollywood films and where several Bollywood films are filmed, and a lot of, most recently what's being filmed there is an Indian franchise for Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So Mumbai, like many cities across the world, is undergoing some very interesting spatial transformation. Property developers and investors have descended upon these very centrally located properties, seeking to upgrade urban land and replace low productive industries and squatter settlements with what are called more profitable residential and commercial developments. Now, governments have not been the neoliberal, they have enabled this kind of neoliberal politics, but really neoliberal logics in Indian cities do not reside in the state in the same way that you might think of, that you see in LA or in Detroit or many other parts of the world. Because many neoliberal logics actually lie in those portions of society that you might actually usually think of as resisting neoliberal logics, like citizens groups, Occupy types of, so movements, people, the middle class movements, educated movements, these are the kinds of neoliberal logics actually lie there rather than the state. The Indian state liberalized its economy. It really had a protected economy until the 1990s. The economy liberalized to try to attract foreign investment into the country. Since liberalization, the state has spent more on public services and urban renewal than ever before. So it's a very convoluted, neoliberalism functions in this very odd kind of way in the Indian context. But in this presentation, I'm actually going to talk about how these two women who are at the lower levels of this political party and who operate at the neighborhood level in Film City have actually emerged as very central figures in redirecting urban development in this space. So, in Mumbai, basically what happened in the 1990s is the state actually set up this mechanism for acquiring land for infrastructure and urban development, and it created this thing called the Slum Rehabilitation Scheme. According to this scheme, a settlement of approximately 100 slum dwellers who occupy a plot of public or private land may organize into a housing society, solicit a local builder to construct public housing. Once an arrangement has been reached with the builder and approved by the Slum Rehabilitation Authority, the builder then constructs a building. He leases the land from the government, and the deeds for the housing are given free of charge to the residents. So this is sort of a way in which to create public housing in places that public housing has never really existed. In exchange, the builder is provided land either on site or somewhere else to develop and sell land at market rates. Now, in Film City, the area that I'm working in, okay, this area has actually become, it used to be until very recently, sort of an urban economy that lived alongside rural economies. So people who lived here, and especially the woman who I worked with very closely, who belongs to this political party, she actually runs she raises chickens. She was the only one who actually sold eggs in the neighborhood. She's also a money lender. She rents out several properties in this area. When her renters do not pay their rent, she lends them, charges high rates of interest, and then they have to borrow from her for that. So there's a complete dependence on her will. And the interesting thing is, she has become the very important negotiator because she has to get all the slum dwellers to agree to agree to the builder's demand so that the builder can actually create housing on that land. And she and this other woman have been stalling tremendously. I've got all kinds of slides for this Film City. One of their biggest sort of victories has actually been, there was a very major film producer, Bollywood film producer, who came into this land, who decided he was going to build this film school in Film City. This is actually public land that belongs to the state of Maharashtra. He came in, he was promised by the state and the slum rehabilitation people that the slums would disappear, so he started building, and of course these women resisted in conjunction with their slums, and now this is actually what the building looks like, and he had to drop it and move away. He did in fact build this somewhere else inside Film City. It's called Whistling Woods International. But many of the women and many of these political parties around this area that provide labor to Film City actually resisted tremendously, and now even that school has been closed down. In 2014, he's going to shut down and disappear and have to build somewhere else, because the claim is this was public land. This is sort of, this is the way in which Film City markets itself. Here she is. In this area, there are two very formidable women. They're called, one's name is Shanta and one's name is Kanta. I kid you not. And they're actually known throughout the neighborhood as the tag team of Shanta Kanta. And they have become the biggest, the most important brokers or patrons, or what I call matrons, in the urban development in this area. So let me jump a little bit to some of the things that they have been doing. Both of these women, here she is, she also owns flour mill. So people in India, everybody eats the bread, the Indian bread, the chapati has to be ground. So she actually owns this. So she basically runs every possible business in this neighborhood. But she also belongs to the political party. The senior leaders of the political party have tagged her as somebody who they can call on every time they need to, need to run an election campaign. And she continues to support. So she is both the recipient of the party's patronage, and she's a local patron herself in this neighborhood. So both Shanta Kanta have actually been Shiv Sena members for many decades, and both live in households that are headed by them and entirely free of the everyday male gaze in their domestic lives. Now, they are not out of the gaze of the male portions of the political party, which remains very patriarchal, but in this neighborhood they sort of function almost like independent caretakers of the neighborhood. And when I discuss them together, I don't intend to classify either their personal narratives or their public strategies as identical. They are in fact very different. And in private, I found that each of the women criticized the political ambitions of the other. However, they both realized that working together to negotiate the optimal housing arrangements for themselves and their neighbors is the very best and most lucrative thing to do. Both of them actually keep up appearances of cooperation for the slum rehabilitation authorities, as well as for their political constituents, who most often refer to their public images simply as Shanta Kanta. And it is important to note here that at the time of my research, which actually began in 2002 and is still continuing, the chunk of it was done between 2002 and 2009. Both of them were actually jockeying for to be selected by their political party as the party candidate for the imminent elections to Mumbai's civic body. Neither of them got the ticket. One of them actually left the political party and ran as an independent. She didn't win, so now she's come back to the party. So there's a lot of this kind of thing. In Indian politics, there's tremendous amounts of back and forth at the local levels from one political party to another in order to win especially local level elections. I actually lived with Kanta. This is the woman that who called Kanta. I lived with her for about a couple of years, and that's when I actually found out about her slumlord activities and all of the stuff that she was working on. And throughout the course of my research, I witnessed her throw slippers and chairs at the Slum Rehabilitation Authority meetings, threaten to break down doors whenever she suspected they were plotting against her recommendations on more than one occasion. And she actually negotiated constantly with them to get more land than she was actually due. So these political brokers are working on behalf, so it's a very complicated thing. When you think about marginalized citizens, when you think about women, when, people are very strategic. And urban life gets played out through very material ways. And I think throughout this research, I think that this is sort of the through line in much of urban studies, I think in South Asia, and hearing what other people were talking about yesterday and today, that politics is entirely embedded in materiality. There is a certain kind of ideology that right-wing political parties, in this case non-liberal political parties, that exclude certain people, include certain people, but the political subject is neither an ideologue nor a cynic. My argument is that most politics actually gets conducted somewhere in between ideology and cynicism. So, I think that Shanta actually recognizes that she possesses considerable political power, or what I call infra-power, or charismatic power, or affective power, where she's built a lot of these affective grids between herself, her community, and the political party that she's part of. And many of her tenants, and those who have been recipients of her money lending operations, routinely complain to me about how she keeps them firmly under her thumb. However, they also admit that they simply could not do without her help, and therefore are happy to follow her rules in return for the shelter and protection she provides. And they say, see, when we don't have water, she goes to the municipality. When we don't have electricity, Shanta Kanta go to the city government to fight. It's okay that they are here. They are violent, but they speak up and they have the party on their side. Kanta, on the other hand, is very soft-spoken, though she hurls curses and abuses at the slum rehabilitation guys like no other Shiv Sena member I have met. She owns no property other than the house she lives in, and her life is entirely defined by this very profound grief that she's gone through by the loss of her husband and then one of her sons, about 4 or 5 years ago. And it's because of this loss that she's perceived throughout her locality as someone who knows a great deal about suffering. And she also knows a great deal about the history of the area, going back to sort of this idea of erasure, an idea of sort of historical narratives and narratives of identity and things like that. Shanta has positioned herself as someone who actually came into this area long before Film City existed, and she's constantly sitting around in her political meetings telling people, talking to people about what the area was like. And because she has access, or she's perceived to have access to the cities, to the neighborhoods past, she's also perceived to have a stake in its future. And that's the reason she has developed these relationships of trust in conditions of tremendous amounts of insecurity. Now, I think Shanta Kanta are actually very good examples of the complex ways in which local brokers emerge out of brokerage relationships with political parties, and that brokerage relationships or patronage in conditions of urban insecurity is never one-dimensional. They are in fact part of a complicated, real and affective movement, going back to this idea of mobility. People move constantly from positions of patronage to positions inside the state, outside the state, to positions of recipients of political patronage and back and forth. And even when they're marginalized in many other ways, both by gender and class and those kinds of things. And in the complex politics of Mumbai's urban development, the shadow of state force for the urban poor, the urban poor constantly live in this state of under this idea of demolition, displacement. But for the most part, at least in this area, this has actually not happened yet. And much of it is due to the fact that these women gain their political power from this very liminal stage between demolition and redevelopment. And so it's really not in their interest to actually have anything particularly resolved, because they gain their power through these very irrational kinds of geographies. And I don't use the term irrational in a pejorative sense at all. I use the term irrational to sort of define these spaces, urban spaces, and people who create friction between, middle-class ideas of what an urban future should look like and working-class ideas of what an urban future should look like. So I'll end with just telling you a little bit about some of the meetings that I sat in on for with the slum rehabilitation authorities. The two men in this neighborhood are extremely soft-spoken, very shy men who are working for the slum rehabilitation. Now they actually work for the private, a builder in the private sector, but they're appointed by the state. So again, it's this kind of weird structure. And none of the men in the neighborhood ever participated in any of these meetings. And I sat in on maybe about, I would say, about 90 of these meetings over 3 years. And Shanta Kanta constantly screamed and shouted at these men, not so much because they were actually trying to frighten them, but because that is sort of the affective way in which they created notions of their own power, and the fact that they were protected by their political party made a very, very big difference. So there are these dynamic points of friction for any housing development policy, and they really want to keep it that way. So when I asked the slum rehabilitation guys, I said, you know, what's rehabilitation going to do for these people? And he said, madam, just look around. Look at these children who live in the slums. And again, I do not use the term, I dislike the term slum, largely because that's not how people experience their urban space. They actually refer, the vernacular use, the term used is basti, which really literally translates to mean settlement. And you know, this is an interesting, very interesting concept of, you know, how particular kinds of transnational corporations, builders say, oh, you know, let's just get rid of the slum, everybody will become better, everyone will have a better life. A lot of people have actually noticed that when you redevelop slums, you know, slums come about through this organic economic relationship that people have. In this case, everybody here works in Film City, they provide labor to the studios. When you start displacing people, you actually create enclaves where you have crime and all of these other kinds of things. So it's a very vexed sort of thing. So these guys actually have bought into this whole, the slum rehabilitation guys say, you know, when these people move into real buildings, they will learn the behavior of that building and they will become much more polite and they won't curse. So generally moving into a building means that, ma'am, in 10 years, the whole culture of everyone will be higher. Just like the building is higher than the homes that are on the ground. So really our purpose is to raise the culture of everyone to the higher level. So, you know, there is this real conflicting social landscape of planning, because a lot of these guys are actually trained as urban planners, that spatial mobility has permanent effects on something called culture, right? But Shanta Kanta are not at all interested in culture talk, because their power as brokers rests in fact in chaos. And this sort of social production of chaos is very much a part of Indian democracy, actually. So, you know, mayhem in the streets, violence, this goes all the way back to Gandhian politics, actually, where there is this tremendous amount of history in South Asia of public politics being about creating disorder. So democracy is actually not a rational system in India. It's very chaotic, and it's deeply, deeply implicated in violence. Public violence, claiming of public space, etc., etc. Elections are the most violent time in Indian politics. You can be shot, killed in rural India during election periods, beaten up, all kinds of things. And that's how the electoral process works. So this original administrative neglect of the Film City slums, which have now become very interesting to builders because the city has moved outwards, has allowed these very formidable women to assume very powerful positions, because if residents had public services, the presence of these hardly altruistic bosses would not have been necessary. And their very loud public negotiation, their ability to build networks of local trust, are always centered on everyday material issues of livelihood that affect the entire community rather than on anything called culture, right? And Shanta Kanta, I'm going to suggest again, are seen all the time by people in the vernacular. People use this term, oh, they're resisting, they're resisting, they're resisting. Again, I think this narrative of resistance is very problematic in this case, because again, they are less resistors than they are producers of disorder or friction in the mobility's terminology. And it is in this social friction that their power is located. and they tactically work through several election cycles to negotiate between the settlement and the builder by making sure that everyone's real problems get accommodated and voiced, while no doubt skimming quite a bit for themselves. Because both these women actually, in all the agreements, ended up getting they figured out a way, and I was privy to many of the meetings where they actually figured out a way where they could get, basically make 4 houses out of 3. So that's, yeah, and so they constantly negotiated back and forth. The housing has still not been done. And it probably will never be in this area, actually. Largely because there is nobody the brokers here have, even though it's very prime property now, these local brokers have no interest in actually creating a physical, spatialized structure where they lose their power. And then there are some actually really pragmatic things. Many of the people here are involved in dairy farming. They own their own cows and buffaloes. And in fact, there has been a lot of debate about how you accommodate cows and buffaloes in a building that is a high-rise apartment building. No, I'm not kidding. So, I think that urbanization, even in a mega city like Mumbai, there exist these, what you might consider, rural economies that are side by side with urban economies. So, I'm going to stop here by just suggesting that these women actually function as political brokers largely through this politics of presence. And the politics of presence is really a politics where it is viscerally, people actually can touch it, they can touch their politicians, they can hear them, they can go to them in the middle of the night. And politics here is not an abstract sphere governed by anything that has to do with rational politics of the law, because most of the time, these women and pretty much everyone in this political party functions outside what you might consider the law, and the law in South Asia simply does not accommodate, unfortunately, because it's a relic of the colonial past. It simply does not accommodate all of the political relations that exist in real on the ground. So, and this presence, I think, contests a lot of the feminist literature on what are thought of the natural femininities of non-Western women. That non-Western women are, there's all this thing about home births, and you're not really in touch with the material environments, but you're in touch with all these organic kinds of things. These are women who are extremely engaged with the materialist realities of their environment, with their bodies, but also with their communities, and also very closely with the emotional demands of their constituents. And it is because they are so keyed into these kinds of, people will come and talk to them about love and then talk to them about elections. And, so there's this constant back and forth where politics gets embroiled in these multiple modalities that I think simply does not get accommodated in larger political science discussions of the political party. So I'll stop there. And,